In this video, I'm going to show you how to do Hibernate configuration so that you can work along with H2 database, because that was the database that we used in our previous video, and I have showed you how to create your database and the various dependency that we require to do the Hibernate configuration. Now I will also speak about how to make changes in your that configuration file, so not necessarily you can work with H2 database, you can work with any database. So going further, with our first step, we need to create a package so that I can keep the configuration file. So the package name I'm going to keep would be config. So let us quickly open our backend project and right click on Java, new package, and I'm going to use our convention dot shopping backend dot config. So here I'm going to create a class and I'm going to name it as Hibernate config. New class Hibernate config class. So it is inside the config package we have our Hibernate config class. In my second step, in this class I need to add three annotation, that is @configuration, component scan, and enable transaction management. So configuration will tell, okay, we are doing certain configuration and we are creating certain beans that should be managed by our Spring framework. Along with configuration, we'll have our component scan as well. So component scan will tell me where our entity classes reside that Hibernate requires, and also we'll say, okay, enable the transaction management. So we don't have to do that extra coding of managing the transaction, because in Hibernate we require data source, a session factory that provides us with a session. Using session we can create a query that would be executed on the database, but that query needs to be managed within a transaction. So that's why we will enable that transaction management. So let us quickly go to our Hibernate config class. We'll put @configuration, @component scan, so Control Shift O, and you can see we have added that annotation, and here we need to say, okay, base packages is equal to, within curly bracket I'm going to say the base package is net.kzn.shopping backend.dto, because that's where I'm going to keep our entity class. And one more annotation, that is @enable transaction management. So you can see it is available in the transaction, annotation, and enable transaction management. After putting that annotation, we are going to create our first 5 static final variables to provide the database related information. Now these are the variables that you need to modify for any database. Since we are using H2, we have H2. If you are using Oracle, it would be Oracle theme. If you are using any MySQL, Microsoft SQL Server, so like that you need to change this URL, and based on the database management system you're going to use, you have to use that driver, and along with driver you need to have that dialect. Now why dialect is required? Because for any database management system the SQL query may differ slightly, so your Hibernate is the component which makes your application database neutral, so that you don't have to worry about the SQL query. The Hibernate will emit that type of code which is understandable by that particular database management system. So the SQL query would be based on that particular database management system. And the username and the password, because I have showed you in my previous video what was the username and password. So password was blank and the username was SA. So here I'm going to quickly create those 5 final variables. So I'm going to give private final static string, it would be database underscore URL equal to, based on our this, I'm just gonna do 5 variables, database driver, database dialect, username and password. Okay, so the URL we have used along with our database name, that is online shopping, in my previous video. The driver name, so you may use any database. These are the information that you should be aware of. You just modify this thing and your Hibernate is good to go to work with your application. So I have created these final variables which I am going to use further in my configuration. Okay, moving on. In our 4 steps, I am going to create 3 beans. Now, what are these 3 beans? First is data source. So data source will provide the necessary connection information for the database. Next is session factory. So your session factory is going to use the data source so that it can produce a session for that particular user. Now once that session is created, we are going to create a query and execute that query within a transaction, because transaction is an important concept and we are going to use Hibernate transaction managers so that it is going to manage our transaction to execute that particular query. That's why we require these 3 beans. So I'm going to quickly create all these 3 beans and provide the necessary information. So for creating that bean, I'm going to say @bean, and I'm going to say private data source would be the return type. So it will create a bean which would be used across the application, and the return type is data source. I'm going to say get data source. And I'm going to use a class, and that class would be basic data source. New basic data source. And I'm gonna quickly do an import. Control Shift O. Now it will ask which data source. So we require SQL data source. So I'm going to say finish. And that basic data source is coming from your DBCP2. That's what we are using for connection pooling. So that's why I want that data source, and I'm going to say return this data source. Now here we need to provide the information that we have used before in our static final variables. So I'm going to say data source dot set driver class name. So the driver class name will coming from database driver. Next, data source dot set URL. So the URL would be database URL. Data source dot set username. So username will come from database username, and data source dot set password. Password would be database password. Since we have blank password, it is blank. Providing the database connection information, and we don't have to worry about anything. Now this bean I'm not giving any name, so get data source by convention will return a data source bean for me. Similarly, I'm going to create our next bean. So the next bean would be session factory. So for that, again @bean, and it should be public because we are going to use it, and here also it would be public session factory get session factory. But this session factory will use the bean that we created before. So we need to return a session factory. So for building a session factory, we're going to use local session factory builder. Now you need to ensure that which Hibernate version you are using, because this is the common mistake that everyone makes. Which is the version of Hibernate that you're using, so that we are going to use a proper class of that particular version. So I'm going to say this is my session builder, or you can simply give a shorter name. We'll call it as builder equal to new local session factory builder and data source, so that it can build that session factory using that data source information. Okay, and I'm going to return using this builder dot build session factory is the method. So it is going to return a session factory instance. And the one thing that you need to do, it is saying me, okay, import the session factory org.hibernate. So I'm going to say okay, the session factory is imported, but I will going to make sure that the Hibernate version that I'm using should reflect the Spring framework here that we are using for local session factory. So it is showing me 4. This is the most common mistake everyone do. So make it 5, because I'm using Hibernate version 5. So based on the version you are using, you just need to change this. So ensure that it is Hibernate version 5. Now your builder requires few of the Hibernate properties that we are going to add, and we are going to say get Hibernate properties. So this would be a private method that we are going to create quickly. So how to do that? You can simply click here and you can say create method Hibernate properties. So it will do the necessary class return type for me, and I'm going to return a properties. So this property will be based on your Hibernate properties. So I'm going to write all the Hibernate properties will be returned in this method. Okay, so I'm going to quickly create that properties equal to new properties, and I'm going to return that properties. In between, I'm going to do the necessary settings. Properties dot put. So I'm putting that as Hibernate dot dialect. So this is where you're going to specify the dialect. So the dialect I've already have added in my static variable, that is database dialect here. Apart from that, there are various other Hibernate properties that you can put. So I'm going to put properties dot put the key Hibernate dot show underscore SQL, and it would be true. Make sure it is not boolean, it is that string value only you have to pass as an object. And show SQL, I'm going to say also format SQL. So these are the properties that I'm using. If there are any more Hibernate properties you want to add, you can simply add it here. Okay, and so we have coded this builder.add properties. And one more thing, I need to scan all those entities. So all those entities would be inside our DTO package. So I'm going to say builder.scan packages. So I don't have to write manually every class that I want to add it here. So I'm going to simply say okay, scan that packages, and all my entities are inside that package. So net.kzn shopping backend dot DTO and saved. So our session factory bean is now created here. And the last, I'm going to create our Hibernate transaction manager bean. So the red bean public get and this transaction manager is going to use your session factory. So from where it will get that session factory? It will get the session factory from the previous bean that we created. And so I have to create our Hibernate transaction manager. Again, you need to ensure that you are using the proper transaction manager. And pass the session factory. Now it is giving me this symbol. I just need to check which import has been done. See, it has been imported as 3, so I should do it as 5. So make sure you're using the proper version here. So that's it. This is the transaction manager bean. We have created here to manage the transaction. In my next video, I'm going to show you how to create our first entity class. Thanks for watching.